Welcome to Discover Before Sleep channel. Thousands of years ago, the oceans were walls, distant lands were mysteries, and the stars whispered secrets we could barely grasp. Then came a tiny needle, a simple, silent piece of metal. It was not just a compass. It was a bridge, a force that turned the unknown into paths, chaos into direction, and fear into exploration. Tonight, we follow that needle through storms, legends, and the invisible heartbeat of the Earth to uncover how one small object reshaped the world. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let us begin. The mist clung to the jagged slopes of the Qinling Mountains, like a damp, gray shroud, blurring the distinction between the earth and the heavens. Here, in the damp heart of ancient China, the world felt unformed, a place of heavy silence and shifting shadows. A lone figure, a miner whose hands were stained the color of deep rust and charcoal, moved through the undergrowth. His breath came in ragged plumes, visible in the cooling air of the dusk. He was not searching for jade or gold, those treasures of the surface that blinded men with their luster. He was searching for the bones of the earth, the heavy, dark ores that fed the furnaces of the valley. He knelt by a dry creek bed, his fingers brushing aside the slick, wet stones. The mist clung to the jagged slopes of the Qinling Mountains like a damp, gray shroud, blurring the distinction between the earth and the heavens. Here, in the damp heart of ancient China, the world felt unformed, a place of heavy silence and shifting shadows. A lone figure, a miner whose hands were stained the color of deep rust and charcoal, moved through the undergrowth. His breath came in ragged plumes, visible in the cooling air of the dusk. He was not searching for jade or gold, those treasures of the surface that blinded men with their luster. He was searching for the bones of the earth, the heavy, dark ores that fed the furnaces of the valley. He knelt by a dry creek bed, his fingers brushing aside the slick, wet stones. Among the smooth river pebbles lay a rock that looked different. It was dull, dark, and possessed a weight that seemed disproportionate to its size. It was magnetite, though he had no name for it yet. As he reached out to move it, something impossible happened. The iron-tipped tool at his belt, a small pickaxe hewn from the labor of a dozen fires, gave a sudden, sharp jerk. It did not fall, it leaned. It reached toward the dark stone as if possessed by a silent, frantic hunger. The miner froze. The silence of the mountain suddenly felt heavy with a presence he could not see. He pulled the tool away, feeling a strange, elastic resistance, a ghostly tension in the air that defied the weight of the metal. When he let go, the iron leaped. There was a sharp clack as metal met stone, a sound that echoed through the ravine like a gavel striking a bench. He pulled it back again, his heart hammering against his ribs. The stone did not move, it did not glow, and it did not speak. Yet it held a power that bypassed the senses. It was a piece of the primordial world, a fragment of a hidden logic that had existed long before the first fire was struck. He lifted the stone, marveling at how it felt in his palm. It was cold, colder than the surrounding earth, as if it drew its temperature from a place where the sun never reached. He held it near a scattering of iron filings he had cleared from his pouch, and watched in hushed awe as the black dust stood up on end. The tiny shards of iron danced. They rose like a miniature forest, swaying in response to the stone's silent command, aligning themselves in patterns that mirrored the invisible ripples of a pond. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the mountain chill. He was touching the invisible. In this moment, the mountain was no longer just a collection of rock and timber. It was a cathedral of hidden forces. The miner looked at the stone and saw not a tool, but a mystery. To him, it felt as though the earth had a soul, a longing that manifested in this strange, magnetic embrace. He thought of the legends of his ancestors, of the spirits that resided in the deep places of the world. But this was different. This was tangible, It was a physical manifestation of a will that existed outside of human desire. As he began the long descent back toward the village, the stone tucked securely in a leather fold. He kept reaching in to touch it. He felt the pull through the thick hide, a constant, nagging tug toward the tools hanging from his waist. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. But the miner's eyes remained fixed on the path, his mind occupied by the weight in his pocket. He realized that the world was not as solid as it appeared. Beneath the surface of things, beneath the soil and the trees and the skin of men, there were threads being pulled. The village fires flickered in the distance, small and fragile against the vastness of the night. As he walked, he passed through a grove of bamboo, the stalks creaking in the wind like the floorboards of a ghost house. He thought of how men navigated by the stars, looking up to the distant, cold lights of the heavens to find their way home. But now, he held a piece of the earth that seemed to have its own internal north, a piece of the ground that knew something the stars did not. He reached his small hut on the outskirts of the settlement, the smell of wood smoke and fermented grain greeting him. He did not go to his family immediately. Instead, he sat by the low light of a single oil lamp and placed the stone on a wooden table. He took a small iron needle used for stitching heavy canvas and brought it close. The needle twitched. It spun on the rough wood, agitated, seeking the stone with a desperate, singular focus. He spent the night in a state of wakeful trance, moving the needle around the stone, mapping the limits of this invisible reach. He found that the force was not a simple grab, it had a shape. There were paths the needle wanted to follow, curves in the air that dictated its movement. He was a man of the earth, practical and weathered, yet he felt like a child standing on the edge of a great, dark ocean. He realized that if the stone could pull a needle, it could perhaps pull the world. The lamp flickered and eventually died, leaving him in the absolute darkness of the pre-dawn hour. Yet, even in the dark, he could feel the stone. He knew exactly where it sat on the table because the iron tip of his knife, resting nearby, was leaning toward it. The darkness no longer felt like an empty void. It was filled with the architecture of this unseen power. He understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that humanity had been walking through a sea of invisible currents without ever knowing they were wet. As the first light of dawn began to gray the paper windows of his hut, he picked up the stone one last time. It felt heavier now, weighted with the implication of what it could mean. If the earth could speak to iron, what else was it saying? He stepped outside, watching the morning mist burn off the paddies. The world looked the same, the water buffalo lowing in the distance, the smell of damp earth, the rhythmic sound of a neighbor's grindstone. But for him, the veil had been lifted. The stone was a key, and the lock was the very planet beneath his feet. He began to wonder if this pull was local to his mountain, or if the entire world was threaded with these silent, iron-hungry veins. The stone did not remain a secret of the mountains for long. As the years bled into decades, the dark, heavy, or found its way into the shadowed studies of scholars and the quiet courts of philosophers. In the flickering light of tallow candles, men with silvering hair and ink-stained fingers began to poke at the boundaries of the natural world. They sat in rooms lined with bamboo scrolls and heavy silk tapestries, placing the lodestone upon polished surfaces of wood and bronze. They were men of logic and observation, yet what they witnessed defied the established order of the elements. They observed a silent, persistent conversation between the stone and the shard of metal, a pull that lacked a hand to guide it, a tether that lacked a rope. To these early observers, the interaction was more than a physical curiosity. It was a philosophical crisis. They watched as a piece of iron, placed several inches away from the stone, began to slide across a smooth lacquer tray. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if drawn by a phantom thread. There was no wind to push it, no slope to roll it, and no heat to stir it. In the rigid hierarchy of their understanding, Objects moved only when acted upon by a visible force, a shove, a drop, or the flow of water, but this was a movement born of the void. They began to speak of the love of the stone for the iron, an aesthetic and spiritual yearning that mirrored the attractions of the human heart. They saw the lodestone as a living thing, possessed of a chi or life force that reached out into the empty air, grasping for its kin. One scholar, draped in robes of heavy crane-patterned silk, spent his nights in a garden pavilion, surrounded by the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the rhythmic croak of frogs. He would lay out a series of iron needles on a table of white marble. He noticed that the force was not a chaotic grasping, but a disciplined one. If he held the lodestone beneath the table, the needles above would dance in unison, following the hidden stone like a school of fish following a current. He felt a sense of profound vertigo. If the air between the stone and the needle was full of this power, then empty space was a lie. The air was not a vacuum. It was a medium, thick with unseen tensions and silent commands. He began to wonder if the entire atmosphere was crisscrossed with such threads, a web spun by the earth itself, invisible to the eye but felt by the very marrow of the world's metals. The scholars began to document these anomalies with meticulous care. They noted how the strength of the pull withered with distance, fading like a scent in the wind, yet never truly vanishing until the objects were far apart. They experimented with different materials, finding that gold, silver, and copper remained indifferent to the stone's charms. Only iron, the metal of blood and blades, responded. This specificity suggested a hidden kinship, a secret language shared only between the dark ore and the refined metal. They wrote of the breath of the earth flowing through the stone, imagining a cosmic wind that blew through the solid matter of the room. Unhindered by walls or skin, they were peering into the machinery of the universe, catching the first glimpse of the gears that turned beneath the skin of reality. In the quiet of these studies, the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. The scratching of brushes on paper was the only sound as they mapped the influence of the stone. They placed the lodestone in the center of a circular board carved with the symbols of the zodiac and the elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. They watched as the needle, when brought near, ignored the divisions of man and the symbols of the stars, focusing entirely on the stone's silent call. They realized that they were dealing with a primary force, something that predated their calendars and their kingdoms. It was a power that did not care for the mandates of emperors or the prayers of priests. Simply was. The frustration of these early scientists was as palpable as their wonder. They lacked the vocabulary for magnetism or fields. To them, the force was a manifestation of harmony or discord. They debated whether the stone was inhaling the needle or if the needle was falling toward the stone in a perpetual horizontal drop. Some hypothesized that the lodestone contained a hidden soul that had been trapped during the cooling of the world's crust. They argued in low voices over cups of steaming tea, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of paper lanterns, trying to reconcile this invisible tug with the visible world. They were like blind men trying to describe the color of the wind, yet their observations were the first tentative steps toward a new era of human perception. As the scholars worked, the news of the attracting stone began to filter out of the academies and into the workshops of craftsmen and the stalls of the marketplace. The mystery was becoming a tool, though its ultimate purpose remained shrouded. They noticed that if you rubbed a piece of ordinary iron against the lodestone, the iron itself began to change. It caught a sickness or a gift from the parent stone. The needle, once inert, became active. It gained the power to pull its brothers. This induction, this passing of a ghost from one body to another, was perhaps the most frightening and marvelous discovery of all. It meant that the force was not just a property of the mountain stone, but a state of being that could be transmitted. It was a contagion of direction. The scholars began to see the world as a place of hidden connections. They looked at the mountains and wondered if they were all connected beneath the soil by these magnetic veins. They looked at the stars and wondered if the same invisible threads held the moon in its orbit. The sense of isolation that characterizes the human experience began to soften. If a stone in a room could reach out and touch a needle without contact, then nothing in the universe was truly alone. Everything was suspended in a lattice of forces, a grand, invisible tapestry where a tug on one thread was felt throughout the whole. This realization brought a sense of both power and humility. They were the masters of their scrolls and their gardens, but they were also subjects of a sovereign power that they could neither see nor command. One evening, a particularly observant scholar noticed something that would change the course of history. He had been balancing a magnetized needle on a thin sliver of wood, floating it in a bowl of still water to reduce the friction of the table. He was trying to measure the strength of the pull between the stone and the needle, but when he moved the lodestone far away, the needle did not simply stop. It did not drift aimlessly like a fallen leaf. Instead, it slowly, purposefully rotated. It ignored the ripples in the water. It ignored the breath of the scholar. It swung with a heavy, invisible dignity until it pointed toward the horizon, settling into a fixed line that mirrored the very axis of the world. He moved the bowl. The needle corrected itself. He spun the needle. It returned to its post. It was no longer looking for the stone. It was looking for something much, much larger. The scholar sat back, his heart racing in the stillness of the room. The silence of the night felt different now, no longer empty, but directional. The needle was not just reacting to a piece of, or it was eavesdropping on a conversation held by the earth itself. He looked out the window toward the north, where the Great Bear hung in the black velvet of the sky. The needle was pointing there, or near there, with a terrifying, silent persistence. It was as if the earth had a voice, a low, tectonic hum that only the iron could hear. He realized then that they were not just observing a curiosity of metal. They were looking at a bridge between the local and the universal, a way to anchor the wandering spirit of man to the unmoving truths of the planet. The transition from a mere curiosity of the study to a functional instrument of the world began with a single drop of water. In the quiet courtyards of the Song dynasty, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the rhythmic scrape of inkstones, the first floating needle was born. It was a moment of profound stillness, a convergence of the delicate and the monumental. A craftsman, perhaps weary of the friction that held the needle captive to the grain of wooden tables, took a small bowl of fired ceramic, glazed in the pale green of celadon. He filled it with water until the surface tension formed a slight, shimmering dome at the rim. With a steady hand, he placed a sliver of wood upon the water, a tiny raft, no larger than a fingernail, and upon that raft, he laid a needle that had been kissed by the lodestone. The world seemed to hold its breath. The needle did not sink, nor did it drift toward the edges of the bowl as if seeking a shore. Instead, it shivered. It was a minute high-frequency vibration, a mechanical stutter that betrayed the immense struggle happening within the atoms of the metal. The needle was caught between the physical stillness of the water and the relentless, invisible tug of a distant pole. Slowly, with a majestic and ghostly deliberation, the tiny raft began to rotate. There were no ripples, no breeze to guide it. Yet the wood turned until the needle pointed with unerring precision toward the north. The craftsman moved the bowl to the other side of the courtyard. The needle swung back. He spun it with his finger, sending it into a dizzying whirl. But as the motion subsided, the needle slowed, corrected itself, and locked back onto its invisible target. This was the birth of direction, not as a concept derived from the path of the sun or the shifting positions of the stars, but as an inherent property of the earth itself. Until this moment, direction had been a fleeting thing, lost whenever the clouds obscured the heavens or the fog swallowed the horizon. Now it was anchored. The floating needle represented a bridge between the tangible world and the celestial mechanics of the planet. It was as if humanity had finally found the pulse of the earth, a steady, rhythmic beating that guided the needle home regardless of the darkness or the weather. The bowl of water became a miniature ocean, and the needle a silent captain, navigating a sea of forces that no human eye would ever truly see. The scholars who observed this phenomenon began to refine the vessel. They experimented with different ways to suspend the iron, seeking to eliminate the last vestiges of resistance. They tried balancing the needle on a dry pivot, a tiny brass pin that allowed the metal to teeter and spin with almost no friction. They watched as the needle dipped slightly, not just pointing north, but seemingly trying to dive into the earth itself, as if the source of the power lay deep beneath the crust. In the hot, dark heart of the world, they carved elaborate housings for these needles, using turtle shells and precious woods, decorating them with the 24 directions of the Chinese compass rose. The instrument was no longer a toy. It was becoming a south-pointing fish, a sinan, a guide for the soul in a world of uncertainty. The emotional weight of this discovery cannot be overstated. For the first time in history, a human being could stand in an unfamiliar forest or a trackless desert and know, with absolute certainty, which way led home. It was a quiet revolution of the spirit, the fear of being lost, that primal, gut-wrenching terror that had haunted the species since its infancy, began to ebb. The needle provided a constant, a fixed point in a universe defined by change. Even when the stars were blotted out by a summer storm, even when the moon refused to rise, the needle remained faithful. It was a silent companion that never slept and never lied. The floating needle was the first piece of technology that allowed man to perceive a reality beyond his biological senses, extending his consciousness into the very magnetic field of the planet. As the news of the divining needle spread, it began to change the way people thought about space and distance. It was no longer enough to describe a journey in terms of landmarks. The crooked tree, the red rock, the bend in the river. One could now describe a journey in terms of degrees and angles. The world was being mapped, not just by what could be seen, but by the invisible geometry of the needle's pull. This led to a new kind of cartography, where maps were not just artistic renderings of a kingdom's glory, but functional tools for movement. The needle was the pen that began to draw the lines of the future, connecting distant provinces and forgotten outposts with a precision that had previously been reserved for the gods. In the workshops of the city, the production of these needles became a sacred craft. Smithies learned that the way they cooled the iron, or the direction in which they hammered it, could influence its receptivity to the lodestone's touch. They learned to quench the needles while they were aligned with the north-south axis, effectively freezing the Earth's magnetism into the very grain of the metal. This was a form of alchemy, a transformation of raw material into a sensory organ for the planet. The artisans felt a sense of awe as they worked, knowing that they were creating something that bypassed human will. They were crafting eyes that could see in the dark, fingers that could feel the shape of the globe. The first users of the functional compass were not sailors, but geomancers and architects. They used the needle to align the walls of temples and the gates of cities, ensuring that the human world was in harmony with the dragon veins of the earth. They believed that by orienting their lives toward the north, they were tapping into the fundamental stability of the universe. The compass was a tool of balance, a way to ensure that the works of man did not clash with the hidden currents of nature. It was used to find the lucky directions for burials and the placement of thrones, weaving the magnetic force into the social and spiritual fabric of the civilization. Yet, despite its practical uses, the mystery of why the needle turned remained a haunting presence. The more they used it, the more they realized how little they understood. The needle was a messenger, but it spoke a language of silence. Pointed, but it did not explain. This gap between utility and understanding created a space for wonder. The scholars would sit for hours, watching a dozen needles floating in a dozen bowls, all turning in perfect, eerie unison. It was a choreographed dance performed by an invisible troupe. They began to suspect that the earth was not just a ball of soil and water, but a vast spinning machine, and the needle was a tiny gear that had been allowed to sync with the master clock. As the sun set over the sprawling cities of the East, thousands of these needles were being stowed away in silk-lined boxes or left to float in quiet shrines. They were the seeds of a global transformation, waiting for the moment they would be taken to the edge of the known world. The floating needle had conquered the room and the garden. It had mastered the courtyard and the temple, but beyond the stone walls and the cultivated fields lay the great, gray expanse of the ocean, a place where direction was a matter of life and death, and where the invisible forces of the earth would soon be tested against the fury of the waves. The birth of direction was complete. The era of the explorer was about to begin. The ocean, before the needle, was a realm of beautiful, murderous indifference. To the ancient mariner, the horizon was not a line to be crossed, but a shifting, treacherous boundary that marked the limits of human existence. Out there, where the blue of the water deepened into a bruised indigo, the world became a landscape of pure intuition and constant, gnawing anxiety. A ship was a fragile splinter of wood and hemp, a tiny island of warmth and breath adrift in a cold, salt-washed infinity. Without the compass, the sea was not a highway. It was a labyrinth without walls, a place where the sun and stars were the only lanterns, and their absence was a death sentence. When the sky was clear, the navigator was a poet of the heavens. He knew the rise and fall of the Great Bear. He could trace the arc of the sun with a practiced eye, judging the tilt of the world by the length of a shadow on the deck. But this knowledge was borrowed from the light. It was a fragile wisdom that relied on the cooperation of the clouds. When the gray walls rolled in, the thick, salt-heavy mists that could swallow a fleet in a matter of minutes, the world simply vanished. A captain would stand at the stern, his hands white-knuckled on the tiller, looking into a void where the sea met the sky in a seamless wash of white. In that fog, there was no left or right, no forward or back. There was only the sound of the hull slapping against the waves, and the terrifying realization that the ship might be carving a perfect, futile circle in the water. The psychological toll of being lost at sea was a weight that bent the backs of the strongest men. It was a slow, creeping horror. It began with a quiet debate among the officers over the direction of the wind, then moved into the hushed whispers of the crew as they watched the water casks run low. To be lost was to be erased. The shore did not exist until it was seen. The home port was merely a memory that grew more phantom-like with every passing day of aimless drifting. They used dead reckoning, a method as grim as its name implied, guessing their position based on the speed of the bubbles hissing past the hull and the gut feeling of the man at the helm. It was a dance with ghosts, a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaos that had no landmarks. There were nights when the moon was strangled by storm clouds, and the darkness was so absolute that a man could not see his own hand before his face. In these hours, the ocean felt like a living creature, a vast, heaving beast that could tilt and heave without warning. The sailors would huddle together, listening to the creak of the timbers, wondering if they were heading toward a reef or out into the empty, endless reaches of the deep ocean. They were blind. They were like ants crawling across a silk sheet, unable to perceive the edges or the center. The stars, which they called the eyes of the gods, were closed. Without those eyes, the human spirit began to flicker and fail. The sea was full of myths born from this blindness. Sailors spoke of the Great Descent, where the water supposedly spilled over the edge of the world, or of islands that moved like whales, appearing and disappearing in the mist to lure ships to their doom. These were not mere superstitions. They were the brain's attempt to fill the void left by the absence of direction. When the senses are deprived of a fixed point, the imagination takes over, populating the darkness with monsters and wonders. Every unexpected wave was a leviathan. Every glow of phosphorescence was a siren's call. The terror of the unknown was fueled by the physical reality of being untethered from the earth. History is littered with the wrecks of those who guessed wrong. Entire fleets, carrying the wealth of empires and the hopes of thousands, were swallowed by the blind spots of the map. A shift in the wind could turn a routine coastal voyage into a journey into the abyss. If a gale blew a ship out of sight of land, the crew became celestial gamblers, betting their lives that the clouds would break. Before the fresh water turned to brine, they would watch the flight of birds, hoping the creatures were flying toward a nesting ground. They would taste the saltiness of the spray and sniff the air for the scent of blooming trees or wood smoke. They were hunting for the earth with their noses and their tongues, desperate for any signal that the solid world still existed. The tragedy of the pre-compass era was the isolation it imposed. Cultures were like islands, separated by the terrifying great waters. Trade was a cautious hugging of the coast, a nervous creeping from headland to headland. To lose sight of the shore was to step off a cliff. This geographical agoraphobia kept the world small and fractured the vast resources of the deep ocean. The currents that could carry a ship across a hemisphere were mysteries that remained locked away because no one dared to enter the darkness without a way to find their way back. The ocean was a barrier, a wall of glass and salt that humanity could only peer through, never truly cross. Even the most seasoned explorers felt the weight of this limitation. They knew that the sun was a liar in the high latitudes, and the stars could be deceived by the refraction of the cold air. There were stories of ships found years later, their sails tattered into lace, their crews long gone to the deep, the logbooks ending in mid-sentence. As the fog closed in, the ocean did not leave many records. It simply absorbed the lost. This silence was the most terrifying part of the journey. It was a silence that spoke of the fragility of human knowledge when compared to the raw, directionless power of the elements. In the midst of a storm, when the world was a screaming vortex of wind and spray, the lack of a compass was a physical agony. A captain could not hold a course. He could only endure. He could not plan a maneuver. He could only react to the next wave. The concept of a path disappeared, replaced by a desperate, moment-to-moment struggle for survival. In these moments, the human soul cried out for a sign, not a miracle from the heavens, but a simple, grounded truth. They needed to know where the center was. They needed to know which way was north, not as an abstract idea, but as a physical anchor that could pull them through the chaos. This era of wandering was a long, dark night. For the human species, we were a coastal creature, tethered to the visible world by a short and fraying rope. We stood on the beaches and looked out at the horizon, knowing that there were worlds beyond the curve of the water, yet knowing that to seek them was to risk vanishing forever. The desire to explore was there, burning in the hearts of dreamers and merchants alike, but it was held in check by the cold reality of the fog. Humanity was waiting for a tool that could pierce the veil, a way to see through the skin of the world and touch the invisible heart of the planet. They were waiting for the needle to find the sea. The introduction of the needle to the salt spray and the surging deck was a quiet marriage of iron and infinity. It happened first in the crowded ports of the Southern Song, then began to flicker like a spreading fire through the Arab dhows of the Indian Ocean and the heavy timbered cogs of the Mediterranean. The transition changed the very posture of a man at sea. No longer did the navigator stand, with his neck craned upward, pleading with the stars for a glimpse of his fate. Instead, he looked down. He looked into a small wooden binnacle, where a sliver of magnetized iron rested in its bath of oil or water, sheltered from the wind. In that small darkened box, the invisible forces of the planet were being translated into human survival. To a sailor who had spent a lifetime in the blind era, the compass was nothing short of a miracle. Imagine a ship caught in the milk sea of a thick equatorial fog. The air is so saturated with moisture that the masts disappear into the gray overhead, and the water is as flat and featureless as an unpolished mirror. For days, there has been no sun to mark the passage of time, no North Star to anchor the night. Before the needle, the crew would be paralyzed by a mounting, suffocating dread. But now, the captain approaches the binnacle. He clears the condensation from the glass. There, beneath the surface, the needle is alive. It does not waver. It does not succumb to the disorientation of the men. It shivers with a secret knowledge, this dark tip pointing with a cold mechanical loyalty toward a destination the human eye cannot see. The compass did not just provide a direction, provided a course. This was a new concept, the ability to draw a straight line through a curved and chaotic world. The needle allowed for dead reckoning to become a science of precision. A navigator could now hold a steady angle against the wind, correcting for the leeway of the waves. Even in the pitch black of a moonless gale, the storm might scream through the rigging, and the deck might tilt until the scuppers took on water. But the needle remained, the one unmoving thing. In a universe of motion, it was a psychic anchor. The psychological shift was profound. The sea, once a place of existential terror, was becoming a grid. The terror of the fog was replaced by a grim, calculated confidence. As the needle led the way, ships began to do the unthinkable. They left the coast. For millennia, sailors had hugged the shore, keeping the comforting sight of cliffs and headlands within view. Even if it meant a longer and more dangerous journey through rocky shallows, with the needle they turned their backs on the land. They ventured out into the blue water, where the depths were measured in miles, and the horizon was a perfect, unbroken circle. The compass gave them the courage to embrace the vastness. It was the needle that allowed the first brave hulls to strike out across the Arabian Sea, cutting the time of trade in half. It was the needle that allowed the explorers to believe that the ocean was not a wall, but a bridge. The scene on the deck of a night-bound ship was one of eerie, focused stillness. The helmsman's face would be lit from below by the soft, warm glow of a single lantern placed inside the binnacle. His eyes were fixed on the needle, his hands adjusting the great wooden tiller in a constant rhythmic dialogue with the magnetic pull. He was not steering by the waves. He was steering by a force that felt like a low, steady hum in the bones of the ship. Outside that circle of light, the ocean was a roaring black void. But inside the light, there was order. There was a path. The needle was a tether connecting the tiny, fragile community of the ship to the massive, stable heart of the earth. This mastery of the fog and the night began to reshape the world's economy. Ships could now sail during the off-seasons when the skies were traditionally too overcast for navigation. The winter months, once a time of dormant ports and silent docks, became seasons of activity. Schedules became more predictable. A merchant could calculate the arrival of a cargo of cloves or silk with a new mathematical certainty. The needle was a catalyst for efficiency, a tool that squeezed the globe, bringing distant shores closer together. Simply by removing the delays of the lost, the oceans were no longer barriers of mystery. They were becoming the arteries of a growing global body. Yet even as it was used, the compass remained a source of profound mystery to those who relied on it. Sailors, a famously superstitious lot, viewed the needle with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. They noticed that as they traveled to far-flung latitudes, the needle's behavior changed. Sometimes it dipped toward the water. Sometimes it veered slightly away from the true north of the stars. They whispered about magnetic islands that could pull the nails from a ship's hull, or giant lodestone mountains at the top of the world that would trap any vessel that came too close. They were using a power they did not understand to conquer a world they had not yet mapped, and that gap in knowledge was filled with the ghosts of the deep. In the midst of a great storm, the compass was the heart of the ship's survival. When the rain lashed down in stinging horizontal sheets and the spray blinded the lookouts, the navigator would huddle over the binnacle like a priest over an altar. He would protect the needle with his own body, ensuring that the light did not blow out. For if the needle was lost, the ship was a leaf in a whirlwind. In those desperate hours, the relationship between the man and the instrument became intimate and spiritual. The needle was the only thing that spoke the truth when the senses were being lied to by the fury of the elements. It was the voice of the earth whispering this way through the deafening roar of the gale. As the years passed, the design of the marine compass became more sophisticated. The compass rose, the beautiful star-shaped diagram of the winds was painted onto a circular card that was attached directly to the needle. Now the entire card turned. A sailor did not have to calculate an angle. He simply watched the world's directions rotate beneath his gaze. The instrument was becoming more intuitive, more invisible. It was being integrated into the very instinct of the sailor. The needle was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was an extension of the human nervous system, a new sense that allowed the species to feel the magnetic breath of the planet. The ships grew larger, the voyages grew longer, and the maps grew more crowded with the names of new lands. But at the center of every deck, in the quietest part of the ship, the needle continued its silent work. It guided the galleons of Spain through the endless Pacific. It led the treasure fleets of the Ming through the typhoons of the South China Sea. It was the silent witness to the dawn of a new era. The world was opening not because the oceans had changed, but because humanity had learned to see through the darkness. The needle had turned the sea from a graveyard of the lost into a theater of the found. For centuries, the needle had been a servant whose master was unknown. It was used, relied upon, and even worshipped, but the source of its singular devotion remained a ghost in the machinery of the world. In the grand libraries and drafty laboratories of the late Renaissance, a new kind of questioning began to take root. Men were no longer satisfied with the love of the stone or the breath of the stars. They began to look at the needle's behavior not as a magical trick, but as a piece of data. They noticed that as they moved across the surface of the globe, the needle did not merely point. It tilted. This dip, a downward yearning that pulled the north end of the iron toward the dirt, suggested that the attraction was not coming from a distant star or a mythical mountain at the edge of the map. It was coming from below. The realization arrived like a slow dawning of light over a vast, dark landscape. A physician and natural philosopher working in the quiet of a London study began to construct a miniature version of the universe to test a radical hypothesis. He carved a great sphere out of solid magnetite, a Torella or little earth, polishing it until it shone like a dark mirror. He took a tiny balanced needle and moved it over the surface of this stone ball. To his astonishment, and to the eventual shock of the scientific world, the needle behaved exactly as it did on the open ocean. At the equator of the stone ball, the needle lay flat. As he moved it toward the poles, it began to dive, its nose dipping toward the center of the sphere. The conclusion was unavoidable, monumental, and terrifyingly beautiful. The Earth itself was a giant magnet. This was a shift in the human perspective that rivaled the realization that the world was round. Suddenly, the ground beneath one's feet was no longer a passive stage of soil and rock. It was a dynamic, active participant in the cosmos. The Earth was not just a place where things happened, it was an entity that generated a field, a massive, invisible bubble of protection and influence that extended far out into the heavens. The needle was not being pulled by a distant northern star, it was being guided by a tectonic heart. Humanity was walking upon a gargantuan lodestone, a spinning iron engine that had been humming in the silence of space for eons. The spirit of the needle was in fact the signature of the planet's own internal life. This discovery transformed the way men perceived the deep interior of the world. They began to imagine the fires and the pressures that existed miles beneath the crust. They hypothesized that the center of the world was a solid or molten core of iron, a planetary dynamo that generated this field as it spun. The Earth was reimagined as a piece of celestial clockwork, a living magnet that held its atmosphere and its creatures in a protective embrace. This was a moment of profound scientific synthesis, the marriage of the cosmic and the terrestrial. The same force that kept the sailor from drifting into the abyss was the force that defined the very structure of the globe. But this new clarity brought with it a new set of puzzles. If the Earth was a magnet, why did the needle not point to the true north of the geographic pole? Why did it wander, shifting its alignment by a few degrees every year? This variation suggested that the Earth's magnetic heart was not a static thing. It was alive, shifting and flowing like a subterranean river. The magnetic poles were not fixed points on a map, they were wandering spirits migrating across the Arctic wastes with a slow geological patience. This meant that the Earth's internal landscape was in constant motion, a liquid world of metal and heat that defied the permanence of the continents above. The emotional impact of this was a sense of standing on a living creature. People looked at the horizon and realized they were suspended in a lattice of magnetic flux. Every forest, every ocean, every city was threaded with these invisible lines of force curving out from the south and diving back into the north. We were living inside a giant spherical loom. The realization that the Earth was a magnet gave a new meaning to the word connection. It was no longer a metaphorical idea, it was a physical fact. Every person, every iron nail, every compass was physically linked to the core of the planet by a tether of magnetism. We were never truly untethered, we were always being held. As this knowledge spread, it began to strip away the last remnants of ancient superstition. The magnetic islands and lodestone mountains vanished from the maps, replaced by the elegant mathematics of the magnetic field. The mystery had not been diminished, it had been elevated. To understand that the Earth was a magnet was to recognize the scale of the universe's laws. It was a realization that the laws of the study, the laws observed in a small bowl of water or a tiny piece of, or were the same laws that governed the stars and the planets. The local was the universal. This was the birth of true planetary science, the moment when humanity stopped looking at the Earth as a collection of separate lands and started seeing it as a single integrated system. In the laboratories, the experiments became more sophisticated. Philosophers began to wonder if electricity and magnetism were siblings, two faces of the same hidden god. They noticed how lightning could scramble a ship's compass or how a wire carrying a current could make a needle twitch. The discovery that the Earth was a magnet was the first domino in a chain that would eventually lead to the mastery of the electron. It was the foundation of the modern world. Every motor, every generator, every digital screen traces its lineage back to that moment when a man moved a needle over a stone sphere and realized that he was touching the pulse of the world. The image of the Earth as a magnet remains one of the most poetic and powerful concepts in science. It depicts a world that is not just a rock floating in a vacuum, but a world that is clothed in its own field, a world that has its own internal compass. As the scholars of the era closed their books and looked out at the night sky, they felt a new kind of awe. They were no longer lost in a cold, indifferent infinity. They were residents of a magnificent magnetic vessel, a ship of stone and iron sailing through the dark, guided by the same silent forces that turned the needle in the binnacle. The Earth was no longer just the ground, it was the guide. But as the light of understanding grew, it cast long, distorted shadows. For the common soul far removed from the polished spheres of the Torella and the quiet discourse of academies, the revelation of an invisible world encompassing force was not a comfort, it was a source of profound existential dread. To be told that the very air was thick with a power that could move metal but remain unfelt by human skin was to be told that the world was haunted by a logic that bypassed the senses. In the smoky taverns of port cities and the isolated hamlets of the countryside, the compass was viewed with a squinted eye. It was the devil's finger, a sliver of iron that had made a pact with the unseen. Fear is the natural reaction to a force that cannot be blocked, seen, or bartered with. People began to look at the needle with a sense of disbelief that bordered on the religious. If a stone could pull a needle through a thick wooden table, what was to stop it from pulling the iron from a man's blood? What was to stop these invisible threads from tangling the soul? In the 17th century, the boundary between science and sorcery was a porous, flickering thing. To the uninitiated, the magnetic field was not a field at all, it was a ghost. It was the occult in its original sense, the hidden. There were those who refused to have a compass on their person, fearing it would drain their vitality or interfere with the humors of the body. They saw the navigator hunched over his glowing binnacle not as a scientist but as a necromancer whispering to the deep. This disbelief was fueled by the sheer impossibility of the phenomenon. In every other aspect of life, to move something one had to touch it. To fell a tree one used an axe, to move a stone one used a lever. But the magnet mocked this physical law. It acted at a distance. It crossed the void. This action at a distance was a scandal to the human mind. It suggested that the emptiness between objects was not empty at all, but filled with a medium that was terrifyingly active. Religious authorities and local healers wrestled with the implications. Some claimed that the lodestone was a fragment of the celestial spheres that had fallen to Earth, retaining the will of the heavens. Others whispered that it was a terrestrial trap, a way for the Earth to lure the unwary into the depths. In the shipyards, rumors spread like wildfire. Sailors told stories of magnetic mountains that loomed in the uncharted reaches of the north, so powerful they could draw the iron bolts from a ship's hull, causing the vessel to disintegrate into a heap of floating planks while the terrified crew watched in silence. They spoke of black suns beneath the waves that could spin a compass into a frenzy, leaving a ship blind and spinning in the middle of a calm sea. These were the myths of a species, trying to reconcile its new tools with its old terrors. The invisible was by definition the realm of the monster. If the Earth was a magnet, then the Earth was a creature with a mind of its own, and the needle was its wandering eye. The superstition extended to the very care of the instrument. It was widely believed that the smell of garlic or the presence of an onion could poison a compass, stripping the needle of its power. Helmsmen were forbidden from eating such things for fear that their breath would lead the ship to ruin. This was a physical manifestation of a psychological truth. When faced with a mystery, the mind invents rituals of protection. If the force was invisible, the cure must be equally irrational. There were accounts of captains who, in the midst of a terrifying storm, would smash their bosun's compass, believing the needle had been bewitched by a rival or a sea spirit, choosing to trust their own dying instincts rather than the silent turning iron. Even among the educated, there was a sense of unease. The realization that we lived atop a giant magnet meant that we were subjects to a power that was entirely indifferent to human history. The magnetic poles didn't care about the boundaries of kingdoms or the outcomes of wars. They moved according to a subterranean rhythm that was cold and alien. This decentering of the human experience, the shift from being the masters of the world to being passengers on a magnetic vessel, was a bitter pill to swallow. Disbelief often acted as a shield. If one could dismiss the magnetic field as a mere trick of the one didn't have to confront the reality of a world that functioned perfectly well without us. The fear of the invisible force also sparked a dark curiosity. In the courts of Europe, magnetizers began to appear, claiming they could use these same invisible currents to heal the sick or control the minds of others. They performed magnetic seances where people would sit around tubs of iron filings, holding hands to complete the circuit. This was the birth of mesmerism, a strange shadow science that grew out of the real discovery of the compass. It showed how quickly the human mind could turn a scientific truth into a supernatural weapon. The invisible threads of the earth were being reimagined as the threads of a cosmic puppet master, and for a time the fear of being magnetized against one's will was a very real social anxiety. Yet as the decades turned into centuries, the fear began to calcify into a silent, accepted mystery. The disbelief didn't vanish, it simply became a part of the background noise of existence. People grew used to the needle. They grew used to the idea of the field, even if they could never truly visualize it. But the sense of the uncanny remained. Even today, when we hold a compass, there is a small, quiet part of the brain that recoils at the sight of the needle moving on its own. It is a reminder that we are still the same creatures who huddled in the Qinling Mountains, staring in awe at a rock that could love a piece of iron. The transition from fear to utility was not a straight line, it was a slow, grinding process of familiarity. We domesticated the invisible. We put it in boxes, we painted it on cards, and we used it to build empires. But the ghost never truly left the machine. Every time a needle shivers and finds its way home, it is a testament to the fact that we are surrounded by a world that is far more complex and far more connected than our eyes will ever allow us to see. The disbelief was not a failure of intelligence, it was a tribute to the sheer staggering wonder of the reality we had uncovered. We were no longer just walking on dirt, we were walking on a miracle of physics, and for a long time the only honest response was terror. As the terror of the unseen force began to yield to the cold demands of commerce, the world started to expand at a pace that felt like a violent awakening. The compass was no longer a philosopher's toy or a sailor's secret. It had become the master architect of a new global anatomy. Trade routes that had once been fragile seasonal threads, easily snapped by a string of cloudy nights, now hardened into permanent ironclad arteries of wealth. The needle had effectively erased the dead zones of the map, It allowed the great merchant houses of the East and the rising powers of the West to envision the planet as a single interconnected marketplace. The sea was no longer a void to be feared. It was a canvas upon which the lines of modern history were being drawn with mathematical precision. The scene in the great port cities of the 16th and 17th centuries was one of frantic, directional energy. In the dimly lit counting houses of Lisbon, Amsterdam, and Venice, maps were being redrawn daily. Cartographers, their fingers stained with indigo and ochre, sat hunched over vellum scrolls, incorporating the data brought back by the needlemen. These maps were different from the artistic fantasies of old. Gone were the sea monsters and the mythical kingdoms of Prester. John. In their place appeared the rum lines, straight paths of constant bearing that radiated out across the blue like a web. These lines were the footprints of the compass. They represented the human ability to impose a grid upon the trackless waste. Every new harbor charted, every reef catalogued, and every coastline traced was a victory of the iron over the infinite. The widening of the world was felt in the sudden, overwhelming influx of the foreign. The compass had opened a door that could never be closed again. Spices that had once been worth more than their weight in gold. Cloves from the Moluccas, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from the Malabar coast, began to flow into the markets of the north in staggering quantities. The air of London and Paris began to smell of the tropics. The needle had connected the cold, hungry centers of the world to the lush, forgotten fringes. But this was not merely a movement of goods. It was a movement of ideas, religions, and diseases. The world was shrinking, and the compass was the needle and thread that was sewing the continents together into a tight, uncomfortable quilt. The emotional experience of this era was one of dizzying vertigo. For the first time, a person living in a small village could grasp the true scale of the planet. They saw products made by hands they would never touch, saw maps of islands that had no names in their own language. The horizon had been pushed back so far that it had effectively disappeared. This widening brought a sense of immense power, but also a profound loss of local identity. The mystery of what lay beyond the next headland had been replaced by the administrative reality of the trade route. The ocean, once the realm of the gods, was becoming a theater of logistics. The maps themselves became instruments of statecraft and war. A map was no longer just a description of the world. It was a claim of ownership. The ability to navigate to a specific point in the middle of the Atlantic with the precision of a few miles meant that empires could pin their flags to the globe. The needle allowed for the partitioning of the earth. In grand palaces, kings and queens sat with compasses in hand, drawing lines across the oceans to divide the new worlds. Between them, they were carving up the planet based on the silent testimony of the floating iron. The compass had become a tool of conquest, a way to project power across distances that had previously been unimaginable. Yet, as the world widened, it also became more dangerous. The trade routes were not just paths for silk and gold. They were paths for galleons bristling with cannons. The same needle that led a merchant to a profit led a privateer to a prize. The oceans became a battlefield where the prize was the map itself. To possess the best charts, the most accurate magnetic declination tables, the most precise secret routes, was to possess the world. Navigation became a guarded secret of the state. The binnacle was the most protected part of the ship, for to lose the compass was to lose the ability to flee, to fight, or to return. The invisible forces of the earth were now being harnessed to the very visible violence of human ambition. In the midst of this expansion, the human instinct to search for meaning was being recalibrated. We were no longer just searching for a way home. We were searching for the limits of the possible. Explorers like those who first rounded the Cape of Storms or crossed the vast, terrifying Pacific were fueled by a new kind of faith. A faith in the consistency of the Earth's magnetic field. They trusted their lives to a force they still did not understand, believing that as long as the needle turned, the world had a bottom and a side. This trust allowed them to endure years of isolation, scurvy, and madness. The compass was their only link to the reality they had left behind. As the trade routes matured into the great lanes of the modern era, the widening of the world reached a tipping point. The concept of the Orient and the Occident began to blur as the needle drew ships in both directions. The world was becoming a sphere in the human mind as much as in the physical reality. We were beginning to see the Earth as a closed system, a single ball of stone and water where everything was connected to everything else. The maps were finally closing the gaps, filling in the terra incognita with the hard-won data of the magnetic course. The legacy of this era is the modern world itself. Every time we look at a global map, every time we consider the complex web of international trade, we are looking at the work of the compass. It was the needle that broke the shell of the ancient world and allowed the modern one to hatch. It was the tool that taught us that the Earth was not a series of disconnected places, but a single, vast, and navigable whole. The wideness of the world was no longer a threat. It was an invitation, and as the ships crossed and recrossed the invisible lines of the magnetic field, they were weaving the first strands of a global civilization, a process that began with a single piece of dark stone in a Chinese mountain and ended with the mastery of the planet's very soul. The needle did not just point the way for explorers. It served as the silent, spinning axis upon which the power of empires began to grind. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the oceans were no longer a wilderness but a chessboard, and the compass was the piece that moved all others. The mastery of magnetism had become synonymous with the mastery of the world. Great wooden leviathans, their ribs reinforced with iron and their holds pregnant with the spoils of distant continents, now moved with a terrifying mechanical certainty. The needle allowed for the synchronization of history. A command issued in a marble hall in London or Paris could be executed on the far side of the globe with a predictability that would have seemed godlike to the kings of old. The map was no longer a mere drawing. It was a blueprint for dominance. With the compass, the concept of territorial waters and maritime borders took on a hard, legal reality. The invisible lines of the Earth's magnetic field were being traced by the keels of warships, creating a global web of influence that reshaped the destiny of billions. Empires were no longer limited by the reach of their cavalry or the speed of their messengers. They were bounded only by the reliability of their navigators. The needle enabled the long peace and the great wars alike, allowing for the mass movement of armies and resources across the vast saltwater gaps that had once protected the secluded corners of the Earth. This era saw the transformation of the compass from a singular instrument into a complex system of industrial survival. As ships began to be built with more iron, and eventually entirely of steel, a new crisis emerged. The very metal of the ship began to speak to the needle, whispering magnetic lies that threatened to lead the vessels to ruin. The ship's deviation was a ghost in the hull, a local magnetic field created by the massive ribs of the vessel that competed with the Earth's own. Voice science had to step in to correct the needle, placing spheres of soft iron and small magnets around the binnacle to cancel out the ship's influence. This was a literal battle for the needle's soul, a struggle to ensure that the human-made machine did not drown out the primordial signal of the planet. The emotional landscape of this period was one of cold, calculated ambition. The wonder of the discovery had been replaced by the utility of the tool. The needle was now part of a vast bureaucracy of the sea, governed by admiralties and hydrographic offices. Every ship carried deviation cards and meticulously calibrated instruments. The mystery of the spirit in the stone had been tamed and harnessed to the engine of the Industrial Revolution. We were no longer guests of the magnetic field. We were its technicians. This mastery allowed for the laying of the first transoceanic telegraph cables, lines of copper and gutta percha that sat on the dark floor of the abyss, following the paths first charted by the compass. The world was being wired together, the magnetic needle acting as the scout for the electrical pulse. As empires expanded, they reshaped the very cultures they touched. The compass brought the clock, the ledger, and the surveyor's chain to every shore. The organic, circular sense of time and space held by indigenous peoples was overwritten by the linear, directional logic of the navigator. The needle was a tool of homogenization, bringing the entire planet under a single system of coordinates. It allowed for the birth of global time, as ships needed a synchronized prime meridian to calculate their longitude in relation to their magnetic bearings. The Earth was being standardized. The needle was the instrument of a great global flattening, where every mountain and every cove was assigned a number and a degree, But even as it built empires, the needle remained a humble, shivering thing. In the midst of the most powerful navy the world had ever seen, the ultimate authority was still a sliver of magnetized iron less than half an inch wide. It was the great equalizer. A pirate's compass worked with the same physics as an admiral's. This tiny object held the life of the crew in its balance. In the engine rooms of the new steamships, where the heat was unbearable and the noise was a deafening roar of pistons, the men would occasionally look up toward the deck, knowing that their labor was directed by that silent, spinning card in the binnacle above. The iron heart of the ship was enslaved to the iron heart of the earth. The reshaping of the oceans led to the reshaping of the land. Inland cities that had been the centers of power for 1,000 years began to wither, replaced by the great port cities that could receive the world's bounty. The compass dictated where the people lived, what they ate, and what languages they spoke. It was the silent driver of the great migrations, as millions of people crossed the oceans in search of new lives, their fates resting on the ability of a captain to hold a course through the Atlantic or the Pacific. The needle was the architect of the modern city, the global harbor, and the immigrant's dream. As the 19th century drew to a close, the needle had finished its work of mapping the surface. The continents were known, the islands were claimed, and the currents were charted. The world was a finished book, its pages held together by the magnetic binding of the earth. But the very success of the compass was beginning to point toward its own evolution. The study of why the needle turned was leading scientists toward the discovery of radio waves, the electron, and the fundamental forces of the universe. The compass had served as the training wheels for the human species, teaching us how to interact with the invisible until we were ready to build our own fields. The empires built by the needle would eventually crumble, as all empires do, but the changes they wrought upon the map of the human spirit were permanent. We had become a species that looked at the world as a single, coherent whole. We had learned that distance was a challenge to be overcome, not a wall to be feared. The needle had taught us the value of the true course, both on the water and in our ambitions. It had reshaped the oceans into a shared heritage and the earth into a shared home. As the era of the sail and the steam gave way to the era of the air and the atom, the compass remained on the bridge, a reminder of the time when we first learned to listen to the silent, magnetic music of our world. In the quiet hum of the modern age, where satellites weave a digital shroud around the planet and pulses of light carry the sum of human knowledge through the dark of the sea, the needle remains. We have built towers of glass and silicon that reach for the stars, yet we are still governed by the same ancient pull that moved the dark stone in the mountains of the Qinling. The compass has become a ghost in our machines, miniaturized into the microscopic circuits of our phones, hidden within the guidance systems of our aircraft, but its essence is unchanged. It is the physical manifestation of our desire to belong to something larger than ourselves, a constant reminder that we are not merely drifting on a rock in a vacuum, but are part of a profound and living architecture. To hold a compass today is to hold a conversation with the deep past and the deep future. The needle does not care for our borders, our politics, or our fleeting anxieties. It is a witness to the slow, majestic breathing of the Earth's core, a rhythm that spans millions of years. When we look at that shivering sliver of metal, we are seeing the Earth's self-awareness. We are seeing a planet that knows its own orientation, a world that possesses an internal sense of home. For the human spirit, the needle has always been more than a tool. It is a metaphor for the search for truth. It represents the belief that beneath the chaos of the surface, the storms, the fogs, and the darkness, there is an underlying order, a true north that can be found if only we have the courage to listen to the silence. The discovery of the compass was the moment humanity stopped being a guest on the earth and began to be a partner. It was the first time we learned to perceive a force that our eyes could not see and our hands could not touch. It taught us that the world is thick with meaning, that the void is full of intention, and that the invisible is not synonymous with the absent. We have spent thousands of years following that needle across the salt and the sand, and in doing so, we have discovered the shape of our own curiosity. We are the species that searches. We are the creatures who look at a dark stone and see a map. We are the navigators who trust the invisible to lead us through the night. As the sun sets on the horizon of our history, we realized that the compass was never just about finding a destination. It was about the act of looking. It was about the humility required to admit that we were lost and the ingenuity required to find our way back. The needle is a bridge between the finite and the infinite, between the cold iron in our hands and the hot, spinning heart of the world beneath our feet. It tells us that we are connected to the very fabric of the cosmos, that every step we take is recorded in the magnetic memory of the planet. In the end, direction is not a place on a map. It is a state of being. To have direction is to be in harmony with the forces that created us. The journey that began with a miner in a quiet ravine has led us to the edge of the solar system, yet we carry the same instinct with us. Whether we are navigating the currents of the ocean or the currents of our own lives, we are looking for that same steady point, that unwavering light in the fog. The Earth continues to spin its magnetic heart, beating with a slow, tectonic pulse, and the needle continues to turn, faithful and silent. It is the Earth's promise to the traveler, that no matter how far you wander, no matter how dark the night, the way home is always there. Written in the invisible ink of the world, we remain, as we have always been, a people of the needle, searchers in the dark, finding our meaning in the pull of a force we cannot see, but whose truth we can no longer deny. The story of the compass is the story of humanity's arrival. The moment we stopped wandering and started moving toward the light,